Hello, everyone. This is Professor Hamamoto. It is March 15th, yes, 2022. Greetings, 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I hope you're all doing well today. And I welcome you all to the live chat and to the recorded version. That is the archive version of this talk, which is going to be an incredible one. I've been working relentlessly since the end of last Thursday's talk on the long awaited critique. It's not really critique. I'm bouncing off of the book. I'm using it as the basis, the foundation for a sustained understanding of our pharmaceutical bondage, slavery. And that's why I named today's talk Jagged Little Pacification Pills. All right. And what it involves is not just one particular family. Again, there's a tendency for us to get lost in personality. Oh, Anthony Fauci or Peter Daszak or Jen Psaki, right? It's easy. There's a face there, and these, of course, they're miscreants, and we love to hate them. George Orwell talked about that exercise in 1984 is what, the 5-minute hate, the 10-minute hate, whatever it is. But the deal is that once the exercise is over, the problem doesn't go away. So we have to look at the underlying structure out of which people like Arthur, or as he was known back in the old days, Artie, he was born Abraham and he became Arthur. He had a problem with his Jewish identity, apparently, as many second-generation Jews did. And there's a whole argument by the author of this book called The Empire of Pain to explain away the fact, anti-Semitism caused these brothers to go out of their way to addict America and a good part of the world to painkillers as we know them on the street. Their brand happened to be OxyContin. Yes. So I'm expanding it beyond the Sacklers, these smelling Sacklers of what. I'm expanding it beyond the Sackler family, including the brothers are dead. With all the fabulous wealth they had and all the women and the chateau on Lake Geneva, wherever, the penthouses off Central Park, they were dead, man. They were dead by, 58, early 70s. They're gone. They're dead. But I guess I kind of missed the point. And there's one author who's incredibly good, Patrick Radden Keefe. And I'm not going to hew too closely to his work here, although I will cite it because I have my own take of what the Empire of Pain, which is his title, of what it implies, what it means, its implications, its practical implications. So not to take anything away from Patrick Radden Keefe, who I understand is trained as an attorney, which gives him a certain insight into that part of it. The tale. The attorneys themselves are pieces of work. They're also smelly sacklers of you know what. And of course, my dad always told me, go into law, because no matter what happens, you're going to be the one that winds up with all the money. And I think this is the case with the attorneys, because all the family members lawyered up, and the museums and the families, and they're the ones that are the ultimate winners in this, it seems. So anyway, the author, Patrick Radden Keefe, is an attorney by training, gives us a special look as an insider, someone who's trained in that. I don't know how much or to what extent he practiced, if he was a litigator or was in trials, negotiations, but he comes out of that milieu, which is important, I think. But I think more importantly than that, Patrick Radden Keefe had to undergo a lot of harassment. I read a little about it because I'm interested in writers. I'm interested in his work, yeah, but I'm interested in the process that he had to go through in order to get this book published, which justifiably has gotten a lot of attention. Hopefully it'll win some awards. It definitely deserves them. But yeah, there were the usual people following him around. The proposal probably been floating around for months, if not years. He's I think I don't know if he's a paid staff member. I think he writes for the New Yorker. And I mention these names because a lot of people say, "Oh, mainstream media, and it's all corrupt. You can't watch it, you can't read it, you can't trust it." Well, you know what? That's the lazy man's way and woman's way out. These are people who don't read these magazines anyway, so they feel now they have the moral high ground to not really be engaged in the dominant media. I think it's very important to remain engaged in all aspects of our society and culture, and not just take the easy way out and say, well, I'm not going to do this and this and this because it's all wrapped up. That's exactly what the other side wants you to do. They want you to resign yourself to the fact that they have a lot of this all wrapped up. Yeah, drop out, don't go to the colleges, and forget the university. It's all run by a bunch of no. That's exactly the place that we want to take the battle to. And I'm not saying that just because I come out of that environment. Imagine what the world will be like once people like the Sacklers have the entire university system and their research programs all wrapped up. We're not going to let that happen because we got off easy. There's been tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands globally, but tens of thousands of people who were victimized by smelly Sackler sacks of you know what product, OxyContin being the primary one. We got off because we were able to catch them in time. We were able to finally call BS on their Sackler smelly sacks of you know what. And it was only due through the exposure of independent journalists. Why? Because, as you know, mainstream media is wrapped up by the Sackler sacks of you know what. They own publishing to a certain degree. And more specifically, as it turned out, this is something I didn't know. That's why you got to read the books, right? Doubleday, who knows? It might be a proprietary front of the CIA. I really don't care at this point. I'm looking at for information. So even if you buy the Dave McGowan, Laurel Canyon is the source of all our sins, and the whole counterculture was a complete CIA fabrication. Well, that's your lazy mind giving in to the fact that, oh, well, everything's false then. No, it's not true. In fact, I would argue that the Dave McGowan Laurel Canyon deal is a psyop in itself to trick us into thinking the 60s were the root cause of everything. Anything comes out of that, including the popular culture, is corrupt and shouldn't be taken seriously. Why do I mention that? Because, as you see by the title, Jagged Little Pacification Pills, that is an homage to a 1995 album by the Canadian singer. She started out as a child star, by the way, Alanis Morissette, 1995. And she had that one song, I forgot the name of it, but it was very, very, very intense. She didn't write it. I think Glenn Ballard wrote it, who produced the entire album. And I mentioned Glenn Ballard in specific because he's just one of many people who are living refutations of the whole Laurel Canyon argument that was put forth out there by Dave McGowan, who conveniently kind of disappeared once I called BS on his. I'm not saying I'm responsible for his disappearance, but his influence lingers on. I still see it being recycled, and they don't even know who Dave McGowan is by this time, but they just keep repeating this idea that the music, Jim Morrison and the Doors and Robbie Krieger and John Densmore, and of course the great keyboard man Ray Manzarek. These were all synthetics, and the Wrecking Crew, they were a house band. They were a professional group. It had nothing to do with the CIA. These are all hardworking guys with mortgages who had to be very, very good at what they did. So, and again, I mentioned this because when we talk about the smelly Sacklers of you know what, I don't mean to defame or to minimize the entire medical profession, even psychiatry, which I'm really skeptical of has its use, its purposes in very extreme situations. But when you find out that you have a public that is hurting, that's in pain physically and psychically, and you exploit that by coming up with something like a jagged little pacification pill called Oxycontin, then you cross the line as a medical doctor. Artie, Morty, and Ray Ray, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond Sacklers, three brothers, right? Sacklers, who were, each of them were MDs and each of them were trained in psychiatry. So you cross the line, Sackler, and your descendants, and keep your money. You've already got it squirreled away in all the offshore bank accounts, which I gave a talk on this to give you an idea how it's structured, a basic idea. There are books that, if you, and articles, monographs by business schools, it'll give you the specifics on how, and tax lawyers, I'm sure, have written about this. That'll give you the specifics on that. That's really not my interest. I just mentioned that because I said that this whole system, and this harkens back to an earlier talk I gave, a two-parter on our favorite author, Ian Fleming, right, who was telegraphing back in 1960 that this is where the geographic physical empire called the British Empire, which decolonized after World War II, right? All the natives said, hey, we're going with Japan. We don't want to be under British rule. This is China, by the way. China says, oh, Japan is, we weren't in cahoots. Philippines, we weren't in cahoots. And then Vietnam, no, we wanted French imperialism. We wanted German. No, far from that. Most of them went for Japan because they were tired of European colonialism. Right. So anyway, the point is Britain, Great Britain, they lost their geographic empire, but they retained and expanded their virtual empire. And Ian Fleming gave us the tip off saying, hey, it's in Golden Eye, it's in Jamaica, it's in the Bahamas, it's in the Caribbean, it's Grand Turk and Caicos, right? And then Jack Abramoff more recently said, yeah, we're going to go to these semi-autonomous zones in the South Pacific or the Indian reservations, right? That's where we really make our nut, in these liminal spaces, as they're called, right? Their jurisdictional issues are kind of confused and kind of hazy, kind of gray. So that's where we operate. And for us, we little people, those are the areas that we need to look at, the liminal zones. You know the term subliminal, be slightly below awareness, below consciousness, liminality. That's what I mean by subliminal or liminal zones, these twilight areas, like twilight language. That's liminality, which comes, I think, from Raymond. I get a lot of my material from anthropologists, cultural anthropologists, because these are the people mostly trained by the British academic world, and really good ones from Germany, and then later on the US, of course. This is where they figured out how they're going to conquer people by understanding their cultures and use their own superstitions, as they call them, their religions, their mindsets, their mentalities, their mythos, their mythologies, right? Like Claude Lévi-Strauss, their language says, this is how we're going to be able to figure out how to get into their heads and their culture and to dominate them from here to eternity, right? And that's been, so you're talking about some people running around half naked in the jungle. No, I'm talking about Americans, because you can believe that the lessons that they learned overseas, your British and your French and your American, and to a lesser extent German they kind of came in late to the game, except for people like A.E. Kroeber, who, by the way, helped set up shop here at Berkeley, University of California, right? They were more interested in Asia, by the way. The German anthropologists weren't looking in Egypt and the Mediterranean and Africa. They thought that the origins of world civilization, right, this root race that the Aryans descended from, were coming from the Himalayan area. That's another talk altogether. So But it's quite related here because one of the main foci of the collection fetish that Arthur Sackler, and then to a lesser extent, his younger brother, he always referred to them as his younger brothers, Mortimer and Raymond, and they were, chronological. And he felt responsible to him. He's the eldest son, and the parents expected him to look after the kids, as they grew up. But that they maintained that hierarchy throughout their adulthood when they were all grown men. They had their own families and they had their own fortunes. And I'm saying this because later on that came to bite Artie on the patootie, right? Because they resented it after when they had their own money, their own power, their own lawyers. And then I'm kind of foreshadowing the eventual fragmentation of the Three Musketeers, as they referred to themselves. Plus, there was a fourth, as you know from your classics in literature, right? There was a fourth musketeer, honorary, D'Artagnan, and that was a guy named Frolic, Bill Frolic. And it was with the death of D'Artagnan, or Bill Frolic, and he was 58 years old and he croaked, right? A lot of good, all that money did him. That kind of threw the whole family into disarray. And that was really the beginning of where we're at today, where the Sackler family, in fact, Purdue Pharma did a name change, I believe. They still have all their money. And like I told you, I don't have a problem with gangsters ripping people off, whatever it is, right? Like in gambling and alcohol, bootlegging and all that. Whatever it is, whatever type of scams they have, they're endlessly inventive where it comes to being chiselers, right? I don't have a problem with that because, like I said, they gave rise to American jazz. In the case of the Sacklers, they helped museums acquire a lot of uh, just really untouchable, unreachable artifacts from all around the world. And it might have an educational function. And certainly some scholars benefited from having these collections all in one place. But when you start poisoning the population, that's where I draw the line. When you start creating these concoctions that are what I call biopharmacide, then you're no longer a gangster. At that point, you've crossed the line and you are an enemy of the people. You're an enemy of humanity. And by the way, I've talked about the origin of the title today, Alanis Morissette, right? Jagged Little Pill. The artwork for today, the pic in the YouTube, is a photograph of a workman chiseling off the lettering on a monument to Sackler primacy, supremacy, right? Financial and pharmaceutical and advertising supremacy. He's chiseling it off there because the Sackler name's coming off. It didn't even last, not even close to one of the Egyptian dynasties that Arthur Sackler worshipped so much, going so far as to pledge millions of dollars to bring these precious cargoes, these looting them really from places like Egypt and bringing them here to the Imperial Center in the United States of America and then housing them at places like the famed Metropolitan Museum of Art, which had a separate wing, of course, named after Sackler because he wanted his family name on everything. And I always thought that was kind of curious. I thought it's got to be more than ego that they're putting their thumbprint on it. And sure enough, it's just one sentence. It just goes right by him. I think he misses it or misses it on purpose. But the author talks about or he alludes to the talismanic power of naming objects. In this case, putting your name, the Sackler name, on all these artifacts that they had acquired, not because they were interested in acting, just like the Epstein case, right? Hiring Joichi Ito and all these characters at Harvard or wherever, these prestigious research one institutions, right? Funding people like Robert Malone, right? Even though it's at a cow college like UC Davis, which I have always argued that's really where you got to look at the cow colleges, right? The land grant institutions. Harvard and Yale, it's too obvious, right? NYU, Columbia, Cornell. Well, Cornell is a land grant institution. It's not only Ivy League, but it's also land grant. So it has a special status there, right? So anyway, before I get too far afield there, I put that graphic in there to, I guess, engage in a little bit of what the Germans refer to as Schadenfreude. Schadenfreude. In fact, I'm going to invent a little smooth pill, time release, of course, just like OxyContin. I shouldn't laugh because there's tens of thousands of people who are suffering from it. By the way, in this talk, I'm not mocking you in any way. I'm sure you're going to achieve a full recovery. The human being, the human soul is so, so powerful. And if you have not just proper physical, secular intervention, but also divine intervention, hopefully you'll be able to overcome your addiction. So I don't, at the outset, let me say, I don't mean to minimize or to mock your plight here. However, I do enjoy a certain sense of Schadenfreude that people like Richard Sackler and the second, third generation Sacklers have been defamed, even though they're still wealthy. And there are going to be some very angry people out there who are going to bring justice to these people. It's not going to be me or you, perhaps. But they're not going to get away. And it's already starting to fray at the edge. I mean, the history, according to Patrick Keefe here, talks about the sad case of Bobby Sackler, who at age 24 died of concrete poisoning. And he died of concrete poisoning after jumping off out of the window that he smashed from his mother's penthouse, 9 floors, right to the concrete. And even then, they would not acknowledge the death of their own flesh and blood. They were that heartless. They were that immoral. They lacked some sort of empathy gene. Certainly, Richard Sackler lacked empathy. And this Patrick Keefe goes into his college years. I think he went to Columbia, and I think he interviewed some of the people that Richard Sackler had gone to school with. He had zero empathy or understanding for the cares, the concerns, the worries, the aspirations of quote unquote normal people like you and me, because he was already third generation removed from the hard-working Sackler immigrant, Jewish immigrant family, right? A very, very familiar story of any immigrant, right? His father, the father was a grocer. I'm talking about the father of Artie and Morty and Ray Ray. Their father was a grocer. I mean, sure, he built the business pretty high and pretty well, and tried to expand. And the Depression wiped him out. And maybe Artie said, "Hey, man, that's not going to happen to me. I'm going to make if there's a depression, economic depression, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to be creating the depression. And I'm going to be victimized like my father, who was humiliated by it because he couldn't really. Well, he could, but not to the extent that they once enjoyed a certain degree of middle class solidity in an environment, a society back then, which was definitely anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. Richard Sackler doesn't have that excuse today in 2022. But the author, I guess, as a nod to that history, alludes to it in his particular book. So there's definitely some sort of hardness or immorality that is now been sorted out to the third. By the fourth generation, they're already starting to kill themselves, kill each other. And again, I'm not gloating. I'm not engaged in Schadenfreude. I don't take any delight in it. I'm just saying this seems to be the typical pattern from the immigrant generation to the second, third, and fourth. This is true for any group, Asian Americans in particular. I wrote a book on it. It's called Servitors of Empire. And I mention this is because this will be the new group that everybody hates. Now it's Jews, right? Because they own everything supposedly and run everything. But there's a new group that's being positioned for the scapegoat function in America and around the world. That's your Asian people. Because all I hear about is the Chacoms all the time. And, oh, yeah, Xi Jinping. This is Alex Jones. Xi Jinping, the dragon. He has his little chopstick accent, chinky type of deal. So this is the type of BS that Jews of his generation, of the Sackler, the second generation or the founding people have to deal with. So now it's being imposed on Asians, except they live in an environment today that is far less hostile towards Asian Americans. In fact, my argument is that they are being positioned to be the next servitor group that will take money from all kinds of nasty pharmaceuticals, treatments, mRNA, you name it, radiological, genetic recombination, and a lot of money is going to fall into their lap. And it's not going to stick, right? Because the Sackler family, and this is something that goes beyond the awareness of Keith. I don't expect to know everything, right? But this is where I can contribute to the knowledge base. But the Sacklers themselves, from what I can infer from the Keith book by reading between the lines and applying the basic principles of New World Order theory, of which I'm the pioneer because I'm the sole practitioner of it at this point, and I have pioneered something called cultural forensics. I have this insight into what the Sackler dynasty or the Empire of Pain, who their masters were, right? They had a net worth of tens of billions of dollars, but the fact is that they were accumulators, bioaccumulators, to use a pun. Just like an oyster is a bioaccumulator. It sucks in everything around, including mercury. That's why I shouldn't eat a lot of oysters these days, and radioactive isotopes, right? But they were the accumulators of, I'm sure, intelligence agencies. But I never see the CIA or the Mossad or MI6 ever mentioned in this book. And maybe that was how Doubleday was able to publish this book without the author being killed, because he didn't really. The Sacklers were already on the decline in a reputation as well as revenue, because they had leveraged their name and their stock holdings to such a great extent because it was a Ponzi scheme. You have to keep moving. It's like a shark. If you're not moving ahead, you're going to die. So where was this money going to? Well, I gave an earlier talk about all the rock stars. Oh yeah, Bob Dylan, Prince, Michael Jackson. We worship you, right? I gave a talk about how their publishing is going into the hands of it, and their bioaccumulators too. They're going into the hands of a larger entity, because each of them at a certain point in their career made a deal that they get to live like kings and be lionized and worshipped, and have little boys over for sleep sessions, and have drugs and groupies and you name it, right? Solitude. If in the case of Bob Dylan, you can enjoy a great deal of status as an incredible poetic genius. But you got to serve somebody, as Bobby Dylan once sang. But he wasn't, people thought he was talking about Jesus during his Born Again movement. But he didn't really mean you got to serve somebody. And he wasn't really talking about Satan either, as some people argue that he sold his soul to the devil. He's talking about the national security intelligence agencies. That's who he's serving. He has to kick the money over to them, because they might not have recognized his talent at the beginning, but certainly at a certain point, probably by the time he got in with what's his name over Columbia Records, he's a Vanderbilt. What's his name? It'll come to me, right? John Hammond. John Hammond was a guy at Columbia Records, which was also related to radio. But he scouted out all these folk artists and brought them to the fore, all the jazz artists, and put them into the system, because you have to have quality, you have to have artists, you have to have high level of aesthetic accomplishment to make the scam run well. So he was one of those finders, John Hammond Sr., and he was a Vanderbilt who was a railroad baron, and it's all, you can trace the lineage like that. And the same goes for the Sackler family, even though it's not in the book. This is the Professor Cultural Forensics Hamamoto contribution. They were running money. They were running a drug scheme, an exoteric drug scheme on the behalf of these intelligence agencies and kicking all the ton of money. What the intelligence agencies were getting, not just the kickback, but they were being delivered, signed, sealed, delivered, like Stevie Wonder once sang. Probably he's going to have to sell his publishing uh, in time. Otherwise, he's going to have another automobile accident. Yes, Stevie Wonder had just like Bob Dylan had a motorcycle accident. Stevie Wonder, big Stevie Wonder, not little Stevie Wonder, had an automobile accident where he got severe head trauma. And all of a sudden, his productivity and his incredible creative genius, the efflorescence of this just shot to the fore after this incredible accident. Isn't that a coincidence, right? He should have been dead. He should have been brain dead. But instead, he's fulfilling this first finale, talking book, all these great tunes when in the heyday of Stevie Wonder. Makes you wonder if maybe there was a whole Glenn Ballard team of songwriters and producers or Quincy Jones types who also had a severe head trauma himself. Quincy Jones, who, by the way, Glenn Ballard worked for Quincy Jones at a certain time before going indie, right? And Glenn Ballard is going to be doing a live action show for one of these occultic, what is it, Peter? I think it's going to be Peter Pan. There's going to be a live something along that nature. So you see how the keeps going in a loop, right? A historical loop, and we're going to break that cycle. We're going to break the loop by breaking it down. So that's what I'm talking about, the jagged little pacification pill, what the security agencies, MI6, the Anglo-American, because Artie was very much an Anglophile. In fact, I think he married 2 or 3 English women, mistresses and whatnot. He just loved them. The British, the birds, right? He loved them. BIRDS, right? And he spent a lot of time there, and so did Morty. They spent a lot of time overseas. I think not so much doing business with the people in the gray flannel suits, but doing people who have titles, right? Who come from Oxbridge and come from hereditary lines, who are doing the real business of the world, who have their wealth squirreled away in the Bahamas, right? The Panama Papers reveal a good deal of that whole underground network. So that is the benefit to the security people who are really they're protectors of the banking system for the ultra elite. They get in exchange for supporting the Sackler family in such a high level of wealth and luxury. What they get is a narcotized population that they can control, who's oblivious. They can't even find their own butts with 2 hands, let alone figure out the larger macro, what's called the deep state system, which also is run by a lot of indie journalists who they use the QAnon psychology on us, right? And those people I call the heralds or the harbingers. They're the Alex Jones, to a lesser extent, the Glenn Beck's people. And they might not be in cahoots directly, but they're allowed to flourish because they have a harbinger effect on the public who after listening to them, they think, oh, we know it now. We got it down. We read Dave McGowan. We know that everything bad about pop music comes right out of Laurel Canyon. And what that does is freeze and narcotize that population, right? So that's why in the same way you have a narcotizing dysfunction from a pharmaceutical company, just like you have a narcotizing dysfunction in the independent media, you have and of course corporate media, which we all know about, but also in independent media, more often now that it's getting more obvious now that there's very little that separated them as well. Even though Alex Jones has to resort to racist types of caricatures in order to salvage his own shrinking empire, because they're doubling back on him now, right? Because you got to pay somebody, right, at some point. And his own wife had an episode with some of these psychotropic drugs recently. And again, I don't mean to gloat or to, and he came public with it, which was a wise move on it rather than just have speculation on it. So what I'm trying to say is that forget Alex Jones for a moment. I'm saying that everybody who is prominent in this pursuit is in some fashion complementary to the larger system of control. And that information, that realization that I hope to share with you today, if you can wrap your mind around the complexity of it and the ingenuity of it, is not meant to demoralize you. It's meant to force you into a higher level of awareness and study and scrutiny, right? Because again, we see this dialectic working. Oh, yeah, and I'm reading this on independent websites and chat rooms saying, "Oh yeah, I really like Putin. Yeah, Putin is a good guy." I mean, let's stop thinking in terms of uh, cartoons. This is really a cartoonish type of. It's a sitcom, really. It's all personality driven. It's like a romantic comedy. Real life doesn't operate that way. I'm sure most of the people who are watching live understand that. We're going to have to break this personality driven mentality. It's difficult because we're persons, right? So we're attracted to our fellow human beings, the visage, the face, their personality. You know, Artie, for all his problems, and they're substantial, but he was a charming guy. He was a salesman. And I don't just mean that figuratively. He was a supreme marketer. He was elected to the Advertising Hall of Fame decades after he first started as a part-timer at an advertising agency. Maybe this is a time for me to move into that part of the Sackler family saga. The first book, about the first 200 pages or so, deals mostly with Arthur Sackler, the eldest son, who set the whole project in motion, which later eventually turned on him to bite him. He was very resentful of his brothers who had betrayed him. This is something I read out of the Bible, right? The younger brother Esau and all the the Bible tale. I mean, all those great anonymous scribes who those are the ones I respect. We don't even know their names. The people who recorded all these stories and handed them down to the generations to say, "Hey, man, read this stuff. It's going to help you when you're facing a similar situation." So yeah, don't reach for your OxyContin. Reach for your Tanakh and your New Testament and all the commentary around it and all the history, the biblical history. The commentary is it's just incredible. It's incredibly rich legacy there. Um, and that's probably why it's under attack, because they want you to buy OxyContin and to forget that whole heritage that we share as human beings in common, this universal heritage of our spiritual nature, aspiration, and the commonality of all humanity. The intelligence agencies want us to be locked, no longer even in an insane asylum as they used to be called, right? Or the nut house, as we call them colloquially. They want us to be locked into an asylum of our own psyche. And that's the real insidious outcome of drugs like OxyContin. When I say like, the OxyContin problem is not over, right? Oxycodone, I think, is the generic term for it. They've locked us into the prison house of our own psyche. And again, we can go to ancient mythology to talk about struggles that human beings, our ancestors of generations and generations ago, what they had to go through. It's not unlike what we're facing today. So we have to look back into that knowledge. And more recently, in the modern age, as I've alluded to before, and some of you picked up on the commentary in the comments, which is gratifying to me because sometimes I just throw this stuff out, and some of you pick up on it, and that's encouraging. And I think it's a testament to the fact that I have a higher than average level of audience who have gotten away from, they've seen through all these indie books that supposedly tell us the truth about this, that. Not that I have the monopoly on the truth, but I can understand the the function of how some of these books and some of these independent in circa 2022, what function they have. But some of you picked up the fact that I am promoting Gothic literature, not the Goth, contemporary Goth subculture, but the Gothic literature that started coming out in the late 18th century throughout the 19th century, right? So the high point, probably the Victorian age, Edwardian, and then it's sort of debasement of recent time. All the vampire movies that we see now, and the occultic pop occultism is a degenerative iteration of the classic Gothic literature that I'm referring to, right? Robert Louis Stevenson, our own American Edgar Allan Poe, who influenced a lot of people in France, people like Jules Verne. And earlier, Castle of Otranto and Radcliffe. These are names you might not be familiar with. I guarantee the people in the English department, even though you have a captive audience of people who can't do math, right, such as me, and so they're by default have to do CRT and critical or GLBT, right, in the English department, humanities. They're getting tired of that BS. So, but if you started teaching occult literature, not occultism, but Gothic literature, your whole curriculum and the whole university system would be revived, because that stuff's very, very valuable and germane to what's going on in the 21st century. It's no longer just this fusty language, Victorian rhetoric. It's there. You have to kind of relearn the English language, but the meaning and the content, the material, the philosophy, the warnings are there that have been lost through a whole generation of Hammer movies and Universal films being produced by William Castle, as I've talked about in a previous talk on Rosemary's Baby, which he produces a film, but he did a lot of B movies as well. A lot of you picked up on the B movie reference as well. Not as many of you picked up on the reference that as they may be good, right? But they're also, that's the beginning of the appropriation of the critical edge of Gothic horror films. That's where it started with William Castle, who appropriated the external forms of it and used it against us. Right. Anyway, that's another talk. Before I get too far afield, in fact, I didn't even get to. I might have to carry this over into on Thursday, which I'm glad to do. But I already alluded to the fact that Arthur Sackler started out in marketing and in merchandising, and you see that in common with the intelligence network, right? And that's why I'm inferring, or this is a conjecture. Those of you who want to follow up on this, you can find the paper trail for that. But I'm conjecturing that Arthur Sackler got into the intelligence agency through his early work as someone in advertising, right? And this was even before he got his medical degree, his MD at NYU. He was doing it part-time. He was even doing it in high school, selling ads for the school paper and taking commissions. So he knew that advertising could be very, very, I think he learned this independent of Mr. Propaganda, right? Edward Bernays, or maybe he knew Bernays. That's something that we need to explore. But again, advertising, and it was advertising that got OxyContin to the hands of all these medical doctors and all the conferences and all the universities. And of course, that generates money, which he can start kicking back to Harvard, to Columbia, to NYU. All the prestige medical schools he can sponsor. And his son, the third generation, Richard Sackler, as one example, he inherited more Arthur, his uncle's skill at promotion, like a carnival barker, right? A madman, an ad man, an advertising man. He could afford to fund, I think it was in 1984, an academic conference in pain management. Oh yeah, that's when pain was invented in the modern age, 1984, pain management. And guess what? He and his family, Purdue Pharma, happened to have the cure for all the pain, not physical pain, also, but also psychic pain, right? To numb you. So when I'm getting ahead of myself, I've made the point about advertising. You know that Edward Lansdale came out of advertising in San Francisco. You know that Rod Serling, of course, right? Do I have to explain who Rod Serling is? No, I don't think so. He came out of an advertising agency in Cincinnati, right down south there in Cincinnati. Nice city, by the way, with a beautiful art museum. And that's also the headquarters of Fleischmann's Yeast, Cincinnati, or Cincinnati, if you like. Yeah, a lot of these characters are come out of. Someone's got to explore whether Rod Serling himself came out of intelligence, because he was another failed writer who wasn't getting anywhere, just like Gene Roddenberry. Remember Gene Dinkelberry of Twilight Zone? Not Twilight Zone, but the not Outer Limits, but I try to forget it because I hate the show, as you know. Star Trek, right? You like Star Trek? Fine, it's good. I don't mean to insult you, but for me, it's Drek. It's immature, it's juvenile. It has nothing to do with humanity. And I don't mean this to be an anti-Vulcan sentiment, right? And they did have a token Asian guy. Of course, he had to be gay, George Takei, right? Because in the future there's going to be no intergalactic sex. It's all going to be robotics and AI, and there are not going to be any races either, right? That was your last glimpse on the command center of the Star Trek, of seeing women and different groups of people together, because from here on out, they're all going to look like Sophia, the little device that you have in your home to facilitate your orders to the retailer that ate the world, called Amazon.com, Amazon the snake, right? Okay, before I end up here, I do want to forward one of the major takeaways that I got inspired from. He doesn't talk about it, but he inspired this connection with a previous talk I gave on the invisible rainbow. Remember this talk? Isn't it kind of curious how they kind of intersect? I don't necessarily plan it that way, but I kind of am reading in these general areas that show points of contact. It's a history of electricity and light by Arthur Furstenberg, where Furstenberg makes the correlation between the rise of mental illness and the development of psychiatry as a profession, as a distinct profession within the medical profession, right? And it was greeted with great skepticism at first, but now there's no problem. You're a psychiatrist. Oh, great! You're going to cure all the ills of the world. And remember, the Sackler brothers, all three of them were trained as psychiatrists. But Furstenberg makes this claim, and he backs it up with empirical evidence and timelines and historical data, claiming that with the electrification of the world electrical power grid, there was a parallel rise in all manner of novel, that is never seen before, of physical ailments among human beings and animals. And there are also problems of the mind that gave rise to the whole psychotherapeutic establishment of the present. It began with electrification. And his argument, I tend to buy. I'm going to have to think about it some more, but I think it's a very important hypothesis that we must subject to tests. The rise in disease with the electrification, and it started with the telegraph, the transcontinental cable system, but also telegraphy that paralleled the railroading of America, right? The telegraphic wires were on the same right of way as these railways, which divided the country. It united, but also divided. And we've all seen the Western films where you have the native people, the Indians, as we used to call them, climbing up the telegraph pole and snipping them, cutting the communications. Well, we saw it as well. They were preventing us from communicating with one another. I think the real reason they were cutting it, and it did happen, is that their pristine environment was being electrified, and they could feel it, especially when they had the long hair, and they were not living in areas that had these artificial power sources. So they were particularly sensitive to it, as were most even city dwellers until it went electrical. And great family fortunes were made, by the way. Prior to the Sackler family, there were all these WASP families that were making tons of money for the electrification of New York City and all the major urban areas, right? So when that starts kicking in, man, you got a population who are just buzzing, they're vibrating, and they do have psychiatric problems, but it's not coming from some addictive personality, which, by the way, was one of their arguments in recent court cases when the Sacklers were sued by I think all 50 states attorney generals at some point sued the Sackler family, but also other institutions say, oh, it's not because of our drugs, it's because certain people are more prone to addiction. So that's why they're doing it. Right. There's a real, and that's the value, I believe, of Furstenberg's survey of the electrical history with the rise. And that's something to consider as we move further on and headlong into the 5G world, into the world of hyper electrification, right? Because we're all focused on the V word and the mRNA and genetic recombination, right? At the same time we're being focused on that, which is real and is a problem, we're neglecting something that's even more omnipresent, more in your face, and more invisible, right? It's hidden in plain sight, and that's the electrification problem. And there are some resorts, even in America, where there is no electric. I've been to one of them, and you do feel that there's no communications involved, and you can get a camping area where there's no electrical lines running through it. And there's also water running through hot springs that Native Americans, they were so restorative, restoring their bodies and minds, that even warring tribes declared that a neutral zone, so they could all go there to the sulfur hot springs because it had that. There are places like that on Earth, and they should be available to everybody, not just the rich Sackler families who go take the treatments at these families. So, a very important correlation that I make between the rise of psychiatric pharmaceutical, big pharma, that correlated with the planetary electrification, right? There's that correlation there of the communications, electronics, the power grids, not just on terra firma on Earth, but also in the oceans, right? We see these incredible beachings of mammals like sea lions or whales because of radar that's in the U.S. Navy themselves have admitted this. They do their own internal studies. So I'm not, coming up with any unique observation there. And it's insidious. It's insidious as radiation, but the difference there is that we shun, we try to stay away from radiation, right? We don't want World War III breaking out in Ukraine and Russia as precipitated by NATO and their stay behind network. We don't want that. But does anybody say we don't want electrification? We don't want 5G? Yeah, there are certain groups that are saying that, but you don't have entire huge nations or social justice entities saying that, hey, maybe we can reduce the level of craziness. I'm using the street vernacular of nuttiness, of insanity, by evaluating our electronic universe, electrification universe. They won't do it. And one of the reasons for this, ironically, is because when you talk to each one of these individuals, or if you address this problem because it targets women in particular, the pharmaceutical industry targets women, and also the electrification, the 5G targets women in specific, targets them. You find out that most of these people, and the psychotherapy industry I'm talking about, you find out that all the people you're talking to are wired on drugs, man. They're on Oxycontin, they're on antidepressants, they're on psychotropics, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, especially the female administrators or the head of women's studies and gender studies. They're totally wired up on this stuff. So when you bring this to them, they think you're making fun of them or attacking them or creating a hostile work environment. No, contrary to that, I'm trying to say we need to take a look at how sexist this technology, if you want to put it in their lingo, this technology is. But no, you have that. Just like I was telling about a colleague of mine who turned out to be an enemy because they paid him off, as it turns out. I was telling about how all the hormones were creating transgenderism, and I was going through my critique, right? Just a hallway discussion, just saying, well, yeah, this is what I'm teaching. And then he stopped me and said, wait a minute. Says, both of my kids are transgender. I have a boy who's a girl, and I have a girl who's a boy. So I go, oh my gosh, I did it again. I'm Kevin McCarthy in Invasion of the Body Snatcher, who goes around warning everybody about the invasion of the body snatchers. It turns out that everybody he's warning has had their body snatched. And just about everybody you want to talk to in Congress, lawyers, regulators, FDA people, they probably have had their body snatched. So forget about addressing them. Address yourself, address the people who are by you, and one person at a time, we can break the bonds of electropharmaceutical slavery that we have willingly signed ourselves into for the sake of being able to stream Netflix on our iPhones. All right. I have any number of notes that I took from this book. I guess I'm going to have to save them for next week, but I will leave off with another ironic note, right? You saw that graphic for this YouTube presentation of the workmen hammering off the letters, the Sackler School of Medical Education. I don't know what university that is, but they had most of these top university research centered wired. They had them all bought out. They got the Robert Malone, who is, by the way, put out there in order to deceive us that there's change, internal change going on. He's one of probably thousands of MDs at the different universities all over the country and the world who are bought off by Sacklers and others. Because, we're still talking about Pfizer. They're still around. You're talking about Moderna, right? This is just, and maybe the Sacklers were kind of thrown under the bus to take some of the heat off the other ones. So they were giving the information to reporters and others to go in on them so that they can run their game. But you see that graphic of the workmen chipping away the Sackler name. And this is the name that Arthur Sackler, Morty Sackler, and Ray Sackler thought was going to be immortal, right? Just like the Egyptian artwork that they purchased with all their illicit inside games, running their own research centers and writing their own research reports and owning the medical publications that published material that favored their products, as well as buying off medical doctors and researchers and all that. They thought they were going to endure, right? They thought their name, the Sackler name, was going to go down in history like some great pharaoh, right? They thought they were going to get liberation, let my people go by creating this giant empire of pain. But look at it. Artie Sackler has not been dead that long, and the name is being taken off the university hospitals where they donated money. They get to keep the money too. And all the great treasures that they have collected and stored in the metropolitan, their name's going to be taken off there. So the talismanic significance of names didn't really work out for the Sackler family. And it's not going to work out for you either, thinking that you're building a monument to yourself by screwing over humanity. Again, if you're just sort of a run-of-the-mill crook, right, doing this and that scam, then, it doesn't matter. But if you're killing people, then you're no longer a crook. You're a war criminal. You're engaged in a war against humanity, as far as I'm concerned. So they're chipping in, and that harkened back to this poem. It's all the poem that you and me, we hated to read poetry in elementary or high school. I took a lot of English and comparative literature because I loved it. I still do. But it took me back to the Percy Bysshe Shelley, right? Supposedly the guy that wrote Frankenstein. Well, his wife supposedly, right? It was him, Percy Bysshe Shelley, that wrote Frankenstein. He also was a poet, as you know, romantic poet. Studied in the schools, sometimes begrudgingly. He wrote this poem that I read when I was taking a survey of literature course, and the title of it is Ozymandias, and it's the Greek name for one of the pharaohs, Ramses II. By the way, also pharmaceutically had a condom named after him, Ramses. Notice they have condoms named Ramses, Sheik. They have this, Egyptian motif. It's going to last forever, just like you. What if they had these names for condoms that were created by non-marketing geniuses like Jello or Evapora condoms, right? That wouldn't work. You need a genius like Artie Sackler to come up with these names. Anyway, that's the poem by Percy Bysshe Shelley, Ozymandias. And what it's about is these Egyptian ruins that were found. He was inspired by this collection that fell into the hands of the British Empire, the British colonialists. He went to go see it at the museum. 1818, he was inspired. It was the British Museum. I've been there before. It is incredible, I have to admit. You can live there in London for a year and not be able to really make a dent in it. But all that aside, he was inspired by this collection of relics, if you want. I guess the Egyptian would call them relics, but they had plundered, right? Just like the Elgin marbles, right, from Greece. They're there. And the Greek people want them back. I think they should be returned, just as these artifacts should be returned to the Egyptians if they want them. But he said, wow, even the great dynasties of ancient Egypt, once eventually they ran into sand. They became sand. They became buried in the desert, right? Just like the Jimi Hendrix song, Castles Made of Sand, go back, fade into the sea eventually, right? So this was Percy Bysshe Shelley saying, yeah, this great pharaoh, there's nothing left of him except this little relic here. So he's talking about maybe the British Empire. Maybe that's why the police, not the bobbies, but the intelligence people were chasing Shelley all over the place, wanting to kill him. Not because he wrote Frankenstein, because he was making some really radical anti-imperial, anti-dynastic, nasty poems. These were radicals. This is not just poetry. These are like political statements. We need to remember that all these people that we hated to read in high school and in college and all that, these guys were the real hippies. They were these people were trying to overturn these crazy ass regimes that were anti-human in their time. So we can take inspiration from people like that. The true author of Frankenstein, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and the attributed author of the poem Ozymandias, and bring that to the 22nd century. Write our own songs, our own lyrics, our own poetry, do our own research, our own work that will bring down these family dynasties that think they're immortal and untouchable and going to endure for the ages. No, Shelley tells us it's a vain glory hope. And before Shelley, Scripture tells us that that's the pride of sin. Don't fall for it. Ladies and gentlemen, that's my time. I thank you for your attention. I think I'm going to continue with part 2 next time. I will eventually get to V.C. Andrews, but that's another book. I probably have to take 2 or 3 or 4 intense days to read that from cover to cover to get V.C. Andrews. But I will, God willing, be here to share my insights with you about. She's definitely not on the level of Percy Bysshe Shelley, but that really doesn't matter. I think she made an important contribution during the short, not a good one, but she made a contribution nonetheless in the short time that she was here on Earth. So, ladies and gentlemen, with the short time that you and I have on Earth, let's make it matter. And God willing, I'll see you back next Thursday. Thank you again for your attendance. Bye. Thank you.